The night was deafeningly quiet, as if the earth itself had fallen silent in anticipation of something sinister. In the distance, beyond the horizon, a few scattered lights flickered, weak and trembling. George, leaning against the wall of a ruined building, listened to the silence. It felt like the war had subsided, but something inside him whispered, this was just the calm before the storm. Frank sat beside him, his fellow soldier. Their squad had walked into an ambush the day before, and out of everyone, only the two of them remained alive. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped around their hands and heads seemed insignificant compared to the horror they had endured. The ground beneath them still breathed death, soaked with the screams of the fallen. "They're still out there," Frank whispered, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "We just think we survived." George nodded, feeling the cold sweat trickling down his spine. He knew they weren't alone. The voices, they had started as soon as everything fell quiet. First whispers, then sobbing, followed by screams. "It's them," George muttered, not fully understanding who he meant. Frank looked up, his eyes full of fear, but also agreement. They both had heard it. At first, they thought it was wounded soldiers, but when they went searching, all they found were bodies, their eyes wide open, as if, in their last moments, they had seen something so horrific that their souls left with their screams. Ever hear the stories about the ones that come back? Frank's voice trembled but was determined. George didn't respond, but he knew what Frank meant. In these ruins, people whispered about dead soldiers who couldn't find peace, returning for their comrades to claim their souls. Suddenly, the silence was broken by footsteps, slow, heavy, as if someone was dragging their body. Frank gripped his rifle tighter, his breathing shallow. George was ready too, but deep inside, he understood their weapons would be useless here. The footsteps drew closer, and out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was mangled, its face twisted in agony. The soldier's uniform was soaked with mud and blood that could never be washed away. But the most terrifying thing was the eyes. They held no life, only emptiness. "Help me," the figure rasped, reaching out a hand. Frank trembled and backed away, but George remained frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The war had taken their friends, but it seemed this was only the beginning. The figure took another step forward. George wanted to scream but couldn't. The dead soldier's gaze pierced through him, pulling out the last fragments of his will to live. "They're back to take us," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible in the choking night air. The ghost soldiers slowly advanced. One by one, other figures emerged from the shadows. George could no longer breathe, his body frozen in terror. The dead had come for the living, and there was no way out of this nightmare.